I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as ever, we discuss updates from across the many front lines of the war in Ukraine. Hear from the British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, and interview Dr Thomas Clausen on the history of how Germany became so reliant on Russian oil and gas.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 11th of August, day 169. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's Defence and Security editor Dominic Nicholls, live from Denmark, where he's been talking to senior European officials, and our assistant foreign editor, Katie O'Neill. Before turning once more to yesterday's explosion in Crimea, I began by asking Katie about a leak of Russian soldiers' candid experiences of the war.
Yeah, hi, Francis. So this story is coming from Bellingcat, the open source intelligence outlet, along with The Insider, which is a Russian media outlet. They have uncovered a large trove of complaints that have been sent to basically the equivalent of the Russian military watchdog, which is the Russian military prosecutor's office. And what these emails show are complaints from men who have been sent to the front line in Ukraine, talking about, in many instances, how they feel like they were forced or tricked or coerced into joining the front lines, and really telling a trove of documents. In one of them, one soldier describes how he was on military drills on a warship off the Syrian coast when he was, in his words, tricked into joining the front line in Ukraine. He doesn't say war because he's prevented from doing so. As we know, under Russian law, he says that no one asked him to join the special military operation, which is what Putin dubs his activities in Ukraine. There's quite a poignant quote from him in which he says that he lost all of his friends in fighting, that he's in a depressed state, and he says that he's just 21 years old and he wants to live so much. So it's really interesting to get this sort of insight from Russian soldiers. We get a peek of it every now and again with sort of sometimes intercepted communications between Russian soldiers that are on the front line, but that was a really interesting peek through the window into that. There's also instances of families contacting the prosecutor's office asking for details about the whereabouts of their loved ones. There's girlfriends of soldiers and families pleading desperately for information because they're not sure where their sons or daughters are, and they've lost communication with them. So really interesting insight from those documents.
Thank you, Katie. And I understand as well that it's quite an interesting story on the Ukrainian refugees in Britain. Could you possibly update us a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, so one of the most heartening parts of or things to emerge from the war was the warm response that both in Britain and elsewhere in the West has been paid to Ukrainian refugees who were forced to flee at the beginning of the conflict here in Britain. Thousands of families opened their doors to Ukrainian refugees. In order to sign up to that scheme, that government scheme, they had to pledge 6 months of board for Ukrainian refugees who were going to be living with them. That 6-month period is now coming to a close, and the ONS has surveyed a number of families who are part of this Home for Refugees scheme. The survey is quite telling. It shows that a quarter want to halt the arrangement, to bring it to an end after 6 months, which leaves open the possibility that there are going to be, potentially thousands of Ukrainians that are currently living in Britain homeless come next month when that initial 6-month period ends. Interestingly and not surprisingly, a quarter of those who say that they want the arrangement to end are blaming the cost of living crisis. When you've got families who are struggling to keep the lights on and provide for their own family and keep food on the table, it's not surprising that they're feeling that they're no longer able to do that for guests in their home who they have taken in out of goodwill. But cheeringly, 6 in 10 of those that were surveyed from the ONS say that they're happy to accommodate Ukrainian refugees for longer than they have initially agreed. And the ONS survey also shows that nearly a fifth who signed up to the scheme initially are still waiting to be assigned a family or an individual from Ukraine. So hopefully some of those refugees who are facing imminently no longer having a home can be reassigned to some of the families who are still waiting to take them in.
Thanks, Katie. Now, obviously, the biggest story of the last 48 hours or so has been this strike on Crimea by the Ukrainians, and no doubt there's continuing fallout on that. What's the latest that you've heard since our podcast yesterday?
Well, the biggest thing to emerge came late last night. We got these satellite images which are showing the extent of the damage that occurred at that Russian airbase in Crimea. And the damage is vast. In the image, we've got sort of side-by-side pictures which have emerged showing large craters at that base. And very obviously, you can see quite extensive damage to the Russian aircraft that is stationed there. We're hearing that at least 8 Russian planes have been completely destroyed. And you can see from those images that a number of others that weren't under the cover of hangar have been significantly damaged. You can also see damage from a fire that broke out there. You can see the land around where that airbase is quite scorched. So yeah, the extent of the damage is emerging in these pictures, which are really quite stark. Also, kind of humorously today, we had the Ukrainian Defence Ministry comment on this. I don't believe Ukraine has yet to claim full responsibility or to claim responsibility for the blast in Crimea, but the Ukrainian Defence Ministry has put out this sort of tongue-in-cheek mock travel advert for Crimea, in which it is soundtracked by Bananarama's Cruel Summer. And they're telling Russian tourists through that video that unless they want an unpleasantly hot summer break, they advise them not to visit Crimea.
Yes, so we were discussing that on the podcast yesterday, that as well as the military significance of the strike on Crimea, there's also this influence on morale and what the Ukrainians can do in terms of the sort of the information war on social media, with obviously the stark images that we saw yesterday. Just before I bring in Dom, who, as I say, is in Denmark and has been speaking to Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, today, there's also an interesting story of the Latvian Parliament voting to say Russia is acting in state-sponsored terrorism. I just wondered if you had any updates or thoughts on that, Katie.
Yeah, I think this is just indicative of the groundswell of support that we're seeing in the West towards Ukraine and a further escalation of the West denouncing Putin and his efforts in Ukraine.
Yes, and as I say, the Baltic nations parliament has actually said, and I quote, Latvia recognises Russia's actions in Ukraine as targeted genocide against the Ukrainian people. So very strong wording there. And we've obviously talked many times on the podcast about the claims of genocide and what that would mean and the legal implications of that long term. So thank you very much, Katie. I know that you've got to dash back to the foreign desk on what is an extraordinarily busy day for you. So I'll just take this opportunity now to come to Dominic Nichols, who I say is live in Denmark. Dom, first of all, what have you been up to in the last 24 hours? I understand you've been speaking to Ben Wallace.
Yeah, hi Francis, hi everybody. I am speaking to you now from the Christiansborg Palace, the home of the Danish Parliament. I erroneously tweeted this morning that it was the Danish Ministry of Defence, so I do apologise for that misinformation there. But I'm live from the Danish Parliament here. So this is the first full day of a donor conference for Ukraine. So equipment and money. 26 nations here represented. So it was they're all up there now. They've had the sort of morning sessions. We was all kind of getting to know each other, and President Zelensky dialed in video call. The Prime Minister was here, Danish Prime Minister. And now they're all into the super secret bit. They've all had to have their phones taken off them. They've gone back in to actually discuss the nitty gritty of who's gonna come up with what. So today's the main day, but last night there was a trilateral press conference between Ben Wallace and the Danish Defence Minister, and also Alexei Reznikov, the Defence Minister from Ukraine. So they gave a very brief press conference last night, at which it was announced that, or we were told, and it's in today's paper, that Britain are going to be supplying another 3 MLRS, so multiple launch rocket system platforms, plus a load of ammunition. We'll talk about in a moment. But that was all yesterday. And then so this morning I've been trying to buttonhole as many people as possible on their way in, and I've tried to grab people on their way out for lunch, and I'll try and grab them again on their way in. all the way back out later. There's a press conference in a couple of hours where we will hopefully get a readout of who's going to do what. But I did get a very brief chat with Ben Wallace just now in their lunch break, and he said that what they've achieved this morning is they've got a fund of 450 million euros. So that's a new fund that's being set up, and this is so the EU already have a fund which is to basically to backfill countries who are supplying kits. So country supplies X number of tanks or air defence systems, what have you, and they can then get the money back out from this other EU fund for that. That is not what this fund is all about. That has just been set up here. It's not brand new today. It has already been in existence. Britain started it a few weeks ago, but all the other countries have sort of committed to it, and they've pledged a load of money. So the Danish Prime Minister kicked the morning off with 110 million euros, and that by lunchtime that had gone up to. So the fund now sits at 450 million, and this is to buy stuff, heavy metal. This is going to be through a small. Well, as least bureaucratic as possible, Ben Wallace told me. A small number of the leaders will sit around with the Ukrainian defence team, say like what are your priorities, and then they'll go to the open market, see what's available through the sort of existing state production line. So what can be got quickest, and then start fire hosing the cash around. So that is a good move. I'm hoping this afternoon that there'll actually be some pledges on training and real estate and equipment, which we should get a little bit later. But yeah, that's what I've been up to, and I've been trying to make a nuisance of myself and get in as way of as many defence ministers as possible.
And for the benefit of our listeners on the podcast, we should be able to hear that interview with Ben Wallace now.
So what's come out of the conference so far, Minister?
Well, we've got a donation pot now of the International Fund, which is sort of Danish-UK concept for buying more production for Ukraine. We've bought, we haven't bought anything yet, but we have now got a pot up to about 450 million euros. Included a British donation, Norwegian, Danish donations into that, and those sort of things will really help in growing the ability to support and arm Ukraine going forward.
And who decides where that money goes? Who actually places the orders?
Well, we'll ask a number of member states or countries who've been here today at the conference and other donors to be part of that decision-making process, because we want it to be as transparent and quick as possible, but we don't want it to be too bureaucratic. And ultimately, it'll be where there is production space, and where that production space matches the needs of Ukraine is most likely where this money will be spent.
And these pledges today, anyone sitting on their hands, anyone looking at the floor when you go around the table?
No, not at all. I mean, the EU has a different fund. It's a reimbursement fund, and that complements us. That's more of an international fund for the EU across other areas, such as Africa as well, and the Western Balkans. But that sort of complements it, but that's like a reimbursement. If a country gives its own equipment and it wants to get reimbursed for that, that comes through that way.
Secretary of State Dmitry Medvedev said that an attack on Crimea would result in Judgment Day. So do you think it was wise that, if we take it that Ukraine did attack it, do you think it was wise that airbase was attacked?
I'm not going to sit in judgment over Ukraine. Ukraine is sitting there fighting for its very survival. And I think Ukraine has to do what it needs to do to satisfy its requirements to defend itself. So look, I don't think I'm going to sit there and make a judgment call. I certainly think that Ukraine has been put under great pressure by the logistical supplies sent from Crimea by Russia. Russia uses Crimea. What Russia surely recognises is that it can't keep fueling an invading army from a location such as Ukrainian soil, occupy Crimea, and not expect some form of action to be taken.
Elsewhere in the southern front, around Kherson, a number of the Russia-installed local leaders have been attacked and some killed by suspected Ukrainian partisans. Do you think they've learnt at all from the British experience in the Second World War with the SOE? And if so, have we been pointing them to certain lessons that they might want to take from the SOE?
I don't think they need anyone lessons. I mean, I think what I always said throughout this whole process, there was roughly 4 phases, which was the preparation for war, the phase when it looked like Russia was actually definitely going to do it, which could have been a week, could have been 10 days, and then the invasion and then the occupation. And I have always said, Russia might be able to invade, but it won't be able to occupy 44 million people in a country the size of Germany and France determined not to be occupied by such a regime. And I think what we're just seeing is the evidence of that. People don't want to be occupied by a Russia that rapes, pillages, commits war crimes, and they will resist. And I think that is what we're seeing. The details are sketchy, but I don't think they need any lessons. I think, remember, to be fair, the Soviet Union knew all about partisan resistance in the Second World War. They were very often behind, they were subject to a similar brutality from an occupying force, and I think they learned how to do it themselves.
Given how the impact of the war on Ukraine is felt today in Britain through increased fuel costs, cost of living crisis, etc., why do you think the war has featured so little in the Tory leadership race?
I don't know if it has. I mean, I think they both, very early on, both leadership candidates said very clearly, we will continue our pressure on Russia and our commitments to Ukraine. And obviously Liz Truss has given a pledge to spend 3% of defence, or 3% of GDP on defence by 2030, really starting pretty soon, not immediately, but sort of the middle of the decade. So she's given a big commitment that security and stability doesn't go away on its own. And if we're to deal with high energy prices around the world and unpredictably, you've got to deal with security and stability. That's how you deliver lower prices effectively in the medium to long term. So she's been very clear. I think Rishi said he would fund whatever the threat takes or took. I think that was his phrase. He hasn't committed to a specific percentage of GDP, but nevertheless he has recognised it as well.
Just coming back to you, Dom, what's the general mood there in Denmark? I mean, there's been a lot of commentary in recent days about this idea of perhaps certain European powers selling Ukraine out in the long term. There's a lot of concerns about the cost of living crisis precipitated, of course, by the war. It sounds that things are still developing in the direction of cutting Russia further off and supporting Ukraine even more so than is currently being done. But perhaps, what's your feeling?
Yeah, I think there's a grim resolution. Can I put it that way? I mean, there's not evidently. I mean, many of these defence ministers know each other very, very well, but there's no sort of backslapping and how you're doing and can I borrow your golf clubs and all that sort of nonsense. I mean, they are pleased to see each other. There's an upbeat mood, a business-like mood. I think a determination to get stuff done. Like I say, there's 26 nations here, including sort of Japan, the United States. I mean, there's wide representation. And the opening statements that we were able to listen to from President Zelensky and then the Danish Prime Minister, Danish Defence Secretary, Mr. Reznikov and Mr. Wallace, they're all, I mean, as if they coordinated it, which they may well have done. I mean, the message was very clearly, this is our moment. What are we going to do? In fact, the Danish Prime Minister said, we need to come up with solutions here such that when our grandchildren ask us what we did, we can look them in the eye and say we did the right thing. I mean, it's quite stirring stuff, and nobody was left in any doubt that they're expected to lean into this in whatever capacity they can. If they can offer money, great. Offer kit, good. Offer trainers, then that's terrific as well, or real estate, or what have you. But everyone's expected to lean in a certain way. I was asking a number of people here just now at lunch whether if anyone's sitting on their hands, anyone's sort of looking at the floor when they go around the room, and it is going around the room literally one to the other. What have you got? What can you do? I was told no one's sitting on their hands. Everyone's very aware that there are some very rich nations here and some quite small nations, but people are keen to do what they can. There's been no politicking, I suppose I could say, with a small p. I mean, these are all defence ministers, so they're not they're not necessarily thinking through their domestic politics lens initially. So there's none of the slightly foot draggy actions that we've seen in the past from certain countries over weapon supplies. But no, they all seem to be bullish and up for it. And just to the point, you were talking there about Latvia, saying that they've just the Latvian Parliament sanctioning Russia, listing Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. Well, I was actually just chatting to Roland Hennins, who's the Undersecretary of State, the Policy Director in their Ministry of Defence. I was asking him about it, and he said, well, he was sort of shrugged. He said, "Well, it's absolutely, it's a no-brainer. Everybody should be doing it." And I said, "Well, do you worry that there's going to be some kind of backlash from Russia? A cyber attack or something?" He said, "Well, they'll do it anyway." He said they don't really care. So very clear-eyed from Latvia about the threat there. And I think that sort of mood of, look, we all know what Russia is now. There's no hiding it. So the ball's in our court to do with it what we will. And I think that kind of mood is spread throughout the whole meeting.
Thanks, Tom. That's really, really interesting. I think as well, it will be. You talked about whether when or if the domestic issue will start to play on the minds of some of these people. And of course, we were not going to know that until perhaps autumn and winter hits here. But clearly, the determination that you're seeing is stronger than perhaps is being reported in some publications. Just one other question relating to what you've seen in Denmark and reactions there is we've talked on the podcast today and yesterday about the morale impact from the Ukrainian attack on Crimea. Has it been a point of discussion? Do you think it's been registered, what the scenes that we've seen there? Perhaps there's concern about the escalation in the Crimean region. Have there been any comments or observations you can make on that?
Well, I've been asking around anyone that would not get out of my way when I sort of stood there, asking about the attack on Crimea. Everyone's just sort of. I mean, I genuinely think they don't actually know. They probably will do in due course, but I don't think they've been briefed yet. I did manage to grab Major General Vadim Skibitsky, who's the acting deputy head of Ukraine's military intelligence. You might remember I interviewed him a couple of weeks ago in Kyiv, and from that interview, he was talking about HIMARS targeting and how intelligence cooperation is working, and that led to. I'm delighted that Russia's reading the Telegraph, but that led to Russia sort of kicking off in a very, very minor spat about accusing the US of being too far involved in the war. But so I met up with him again. I wondered if he was going to not want to chat to me, but he was very happy, very genial chap. And I was asking him about the raid on the Saki airfield, and he said it was an ammunition accident. I was like, well, yeah, okay, fine. I think that might be. I mean, that might be the cause of the actual explosions, but what caused the ammunition accident? And he just sort of shrugged and said, who knows? And I went, well, you do, what was it? And he said he just sort of wouldn't go there. He wouldn't be drawn any further. So I said, well, are you concerned about any backlash from Russia? This is a very provocative step. I was surprised that Kyiv wasn't hit last night with missiles, for example. Russia, after that initial claim that there was blokes smoking or whatever they said there was, there's been very little from Russia. So I was asking him if he thinks that there's going to be some kind of backlash, and again he sort of shrugged and he just looked at me and said, we are ready. So again, I think people are expecting some kind of response from Russia, but again, running through the whole thing here is this sort of pragmatism, this grim pragmatism of we know what the threat is, there's no more sort of high words and politicking. We've just got to get on with it. So I think that is what's coming through loud and clear from General Skibitsky. But I mean, it is very interesting the fallout, no pun intended, from that attack, because there's wide speculation rather of, was it a special forces raid that went in and set explosive charges? Was it some kind of modified weapon? There's talk of back in the early 2000s. Ukraine had a domestic production line of a sort of Toshka variant, the Toshka ballistic missile that we've seen. I'm told there was a program back in the early 2000s that was apparently turned off. Now, who knows? Maybe that was turned on again a few months ago, and they've got some weapon that no one's seen before. And this was the first time it was brought out. We don't know. But what we do know, because everyone's seen the pictures, is that airfield went up in smoke, and whatever the reason, special forces raid, loitering munition, ballistic missiles, whatever happened, it got through Russia's defences. It got through the air defence system. It got through their perimeter defence system. If it was special forces on the ground, and so any way you look at this, it is a glaring security lapse by Russia, and I think that if it's systemic, which it probably is from what we've seen of the Russian military in this war, then that could leave them very, very vulnerable elsewhere. And I just think that that we've not seen the last of this. I think Ukraine, however, if it was Ukraine, I think it was, but however they did it, they're going to be learning lessons from that and trying to modify whatever their attack system was, attack method, to do it again. Russia will need to learn fast about how to stop it. And as we've seen, this is not a learning organisation. So I don't put great stock at all in Russia being able to fix whatever went very badly wrong in Crimea a couple of days ago. So, I mean, there might be more of these. So it will be very interesting over the next couple of days to see what the reaction is from Moscow to this, because I think if Ukraine can, they definitely will do it again if there's not, if they feel the risk is worth it.
Thanks, Dom. And before we turn to just some interesting remarks by Zelensky on that theme, I just wanted to pick up something that you said there in terms of some of the people that you've been speaking to and what they talk to you about. I mean, you mentioned there about what they read, what their sources of information are. And I think it would just be of genuine interest to listeners. You speak to these people all the time. What do they read? I mean, are they digesting is it just government briefings that summarise sort of confidential information and the sort of news mood? Or do they actually spend time, reading, whether it be the Telegraph, the Times, the New York Times? I'm just fascinated to get a feeling of what their main sources for the war are. Is it the same as us, or is it actually, are they operating in a totally different plane?
No, I mean, I get the impression that they are at this ministerial level. They all get their briefs each morning from their staff, and there's news cuttings in there which are taken from across the global press sphere. So I think they get a wide view, ourselves included, and a lot from the US. They will then, depending on their level, they will then have a layer of their own intelligence placed on top of that. So I think they'll be getting a pretty rounded view of it. I mean, it's always very interesting. I remember thinking when I was in the military how the military on operations is very good in stovepipes. So you have deep subject matter experts into engineering and demining and air assault operations and so on and so forth. But actually, I noticed that it was only the journalists that were coming through. This is now Afghanistan I'm talking about here, but journalists that were coming through and just cutting across everything and roaming around, getting the stories, talking to people, seeing what it was what it's like on the ground. I on the military staff, I would read those the news reports a couple of days later, with great interest, because that was really cutting across huge areas of the war that I wasn't seeing. So actually, the military, for all it's up close and personal with the contact battle, they do need to get their information from a wide variety of sources, including the open press. So they do take journalism very seriously. There are some outlets they trust more than others, and they have to sort of receive the information through the lens, knowing where that sort of political stance is of that particular media organisation. But I think they do rely on the media, particularly in the West. We do rely on the media to give us that sort of rounded view of what's going on. That then either, like I say, they can either top up with their own intelligence, or if they don't have access to great sort of levers of state intelligence, then what they get in terms of news from allies. But no, I think journalists are relied on quite heavily.
That's really interesting. And I imagine, of course, that what we don't really know fully is the extent to which Russian soldiers are digesting things that they read on social media and perhaps read on more Western news sources. From what we understand, it's that they are sort of more consuming what Putin propaganda wants them to consume. But of course, that may not always be the case. And that's one of the unknown quantities of the war. Just coming back to this issue of direct military engagements, Dom, Zelensky's made some very interesting remarks today following, obviously, the attack on Crimea. And it's essentially he's saying that Ukraine will consider how to inflict as much damage on Russia as possible to end the war quickly. And I'll quote directly in full, just because I think this is a really interesting observation he's made. So, quote, "The more losses the occupiers suffer, the sooner we will be able to liberate our land and ensure the security of Ukraine. This is what everyone who defends our state and helps Ukraine should think about, how to inflict the greatest possible losses on the occupiers in order to shorten the war." Now, we've spoken a lot on this podcast, Dom, about the attritional war and who that favours. But if this is true, what Zelensky is saying, they are going for much more of an aggressive strategy, one could argue, than this sort of dragging it out for as long as possible. Clearly, they think the way to win this is through decisive military engagements, perhaps the seizure of Kherson or other parts of Russian territory, perhaps even Crimea. Just wanted to register your reaction to those comments, because it doesn't necessarily tally with what we've perhaps understood the Ukrainian position to be so far.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there does seem to be a more aggressive timeline entering the narrative in the last few days. So when President Zelensky dialed into this conference here, first thing this morning, he opened it up. I mean, he was talking along those lines, and here's a quote that I've scribbled down. Said, "The sooner we stop Russia, the sooner you can all feel safe." And he says that they need to get their schools open. The hospitals need to be safe to operate. They need to get on with demining. And he said before winter. So he's actually putting a timeline on it there that they need significant action to happen in the social sphere, the civil sphere, before winter. Now, that might be because we're anticipating winter's going to be hard in Europe, and that will where Russia is going to be able to potentially threaten to turn the energy supplies off, and that will become more apparent, and that might then put more pressure on some of the, European partners. So maybe that threat out there, plus of course what winter will do for the fighting season anyway, and this suggestion that Ukraine need a big military success in order to see them through the winter, to see the Western alliance shore up and prove that Ukraine can win this war. So this time frame of the end of the year has been sort of mooted in terms of a sensible sort of length of time to be thinking about these things. But yeah, President Zelensky today he said before winter. So it's now starting to creep into the narrative about a time frame. And this obviously ties in with the idea of a counteroffensive in around the Kherson or in the southern flank there, which, I mean, it's either the greatest sort of double bluff ever, or bordering on a lapse of security, because I mean they are being very open about their plans for the south. So perhaps we are going to be seeing more references to an actual timeline. Winter was the first hard sort of reference point I think I've seen acknowledged, but yeah, that might be a new way, a new sort of communication, new narrative from Ukraine, actually starting to put some dates and times on these things.
Of course, also there is the risk that of over-promising and under-delivering. I mean, there's this argument, this strain of thinking that if Ukraine promise too much about what they're able to do in the short term, that the West will be waiting expectantly to see evidence of that, and it won't come. And so I think that's also it's this fine line, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you want to make it feel like there's momentum is on your side. You're able to strike in Crimea. You've got Kherson in your sights. But at the same time, as I say, that if you're not able to actually deliver on that in these kind of time frames, then there's also a big risk that's from your perspective. Don, we've talked a lot about on this podcast, of course, about the strategic and military developments. But of course, these are human tragedies taking place every day, and there's been an update from the Ukrainian Parliament Commissioner for Human Rights on the latest figures for child casualties since the invasion on the 24th of February. Those are that as of the 11th of August, 361 children have been killed and 705 children have been injured. A further 204 are considered missing, and 6,159 have been deported. Now, in a future episode, I'd like to cover the deportations in more detail, because I know we've had some listeners who've asked for an update on that. But what are your reactions, Dom, to when you hear those statistics?
Well, I mean, it underlines the absolute tragedy of what we're seeing here, and the abhorrent nature of the Russian use of force, largely unguided weapons, firing into civilian areas. I mean, it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. I don't want to veer back into the Amnesty International report, because I think we've done that one, but it just again sort of shows that this is a very I think, imbalanced war in terms of the morality, and I'm afraid that there's going to be more of this to come. It's always the civilians that really suffer in war, and it's generally the vulnerable, the old and the young. And I'm afraid, there's going to be more of this.
Thanks, Dom. And before we turn to final thoughts for today, I was talking to David yesterday after you'd had to dash for your bus in Denmark about the ongoing nuclear question, particularly in the context of some of the news stories that we've been seeing here in the West, talking about the risks, particularly from military figures, I should say, the risks of some sort of tactical nuclear strike from Russia in retaliation for what's been happening in Crimea, or if the loss of Crimea were a serious risk from Putin's perspective. Obviously, there's been this talk about Judgment Day coming out of Russia in the last 24 hours. And as I say, I was talking to David about this and the sort of question around strategic ambiguity. It seems that there haven't been deliberately, for strategic reasons, there hasn't been much talk in the West about how the West would react if there were such a weapon used. Perhaps that's because they don't want to make it seem as if it's an acceptable thing to happen. And the more you talk about it, perhaps the more likely it is that you make it a case. But I do think there's something really serious discussion to be had on this, because if it is not articulated clearly what will happen if such a weapon is used, I fear that it's more likely to occur. And there must be all sorts of things that the international community could do to deter that. You could say that, if you were to use any of these weapons, then you would, let's say, immediately switch off Russian oil and gas, which one could argue we should have done anyway, but that's by the by. You could say to do that. You could negotiate with China to ensure that they would agree to the principle that if such a weapon were used, that they too would cut off any support of Russia. I mean, are these conversations happening, do you think? And if they're not, why not?
I would be very surprised if those conversations were not happening about trying to firm up a policy position in the event that something did happen there. I mean, in terms of nuclear, not in terms of tactical or strategic use of nuclear weapons, but President Zelensky, again, in his address this morning, he did talk about the nuclear issue in terms of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant that is in Russian-occupied Ukraine at the moment, and from which there's Ukraine are alleging that Russia is firing from. So knowing that Ukraine will not be able to fire back, President Zelensky was saying that this the nuclear plant is being held hostage. And saying that Russia are consciously using the nuclear site for terrorism, and said there is a risk of a nuclear catastrophe. And he said he was drawing direct parallels with Chernobyl in April 1986, and he was saying how if there was a catastrophic incident at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, it would affect the whole of Europe. The sort of the radioactive cloud that would then engulf huge parts of Europe. So I would have thought. I think you're right when you say there won't be a lot of public pronouncements about the use of nuclear weapons, because it normalizes it, and then that's the one thing that I think policymakers definitely do not want to happen. It's what Russia does. Russia routinely refers to it, partly because it's in their tactical doctrine, but also because they know that it is the sort of boogeyman of the West. But I would be very surprised if these discussions were not happening behind closed doors. Maybe happening right now up in the meeting upstairs here in Denmark. But I think there also, what is out in the public is this idea of a potential catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, and there are 5 nuclear plants in Ukraine. So I think the issue of use of nuclear, as in use of nuclear as a threat and as a potential weapon of war in both the nuclear weapons and nuclear power plant ideas, I think they are very definitely being discussed. I don't think we will hear much about the former. We probably will hear more about the latter, because President Zelensky was it was his main point. He opened with it, talking about the risk of a nuclear catastrophe. So he's put it on the agenda, and I don't think there's any shying away from it now.
Of course, the really uncomfortable thing is if the worst were to happen with one of these plants, that suddenly it would wake up the world to such a degree that it would give Putin an opportunity to force some sort of ceasefire whilst international powers went in to try and control what had happened. I mean, we're in such terrifying territory, but it does posit the question of whether actually some sort of incident that brings the global attention back to Ukraine would actually be beneficial from the Russian perspective. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, yes, I'm inclined to agree. We know that he does like to go for the spectacular, to use that phrase, to as a threat against Ukraine and against the West. There's let's say the spectre of nuclear war is often raised by Russia. I don't think it's at all out of the ordinary to think that he might try and engineer something at the Zaporizhia plant. Even a small leak of radiation, however that could be engineered, would just terrify the West, and it might accelerate the issue. So, I mean, Russia has shown themselves to be able to just completely throw away any morality or ideas of human rights and environmental rights and what is good for the planet. I mean, I think it's in their interest to do so. I don't think they would hesitate at all in engineering some kind of nuclear issue over the power plants.
Thanks, Dom. And obviously, this, as an issue, makes very, very uncomfortable discussion, and also, no doubt, it will for listeners as well. I mean, we're not talking about this in a loose talk, but I do think it's something that, as you say, no doubt world leaders will be discussing in dark rooms, and I think it's right to be seriously confronting this. I mean, whenever a power saber rattles in the way that Russia is, and we know, as you say, that they are unethical in the manner in which they conduct their military engagements, I think we have to take all of these things seriously and discuss them. But I think we're running out of time today, Dom, so I just wondered if you had any final thoughts for us.
Yeah, so I'm hoping that the press conference in a couple of hours is going to have some detail of more pledges from the 26 members here today. So I will obviously be there and bring that to you tomorrow. I did manage to grab a quick chat with a couple of guys earlier on. I spoke to Jaroslav Nad, who's the Slovakian defence minister, asked if he was what was going to be, if they were going to be able to pledge anything, and he did talk about additional equipment. I asked if that was the S-300s that we know that they have supplied so far, and he very firmly said no, they've already been supplied. So I don't know what the additional equipment might be, but sounds like Slovakia might be up for that. I then managed to grab Sweden's Defence Minister Peter Hultqvist, and I asked him if the very capable Swedish airborne intelligence and reconnaissance aircraft capability is going to be offered up, and he sort of threw his arms in the air and said, "Too early." And I don't know if he meant that it was too early to be discussing the issue of Swedish ISR, or if it's too early in the morning to be pestered by an annoying journalist. But anyway, he then shuffled off. So I will bring you more of that tomorrow. But I think there will be more. So far, as I said, that they've got a fund of €450 million, which is not a bad way to start the day. And I think if there's not more on top of that, actual hard pledges of equipment or personnel for training or training areas, then this summit might not be seen as the success it should have been. So I think there will be more, and I'll find out later and bring that to you tomorrow.
Earlier this week, I spoke again to Dr Thomas Clausen, a historian by training who now works for a think tank in Berlin. We spoke about the evolving situation in Germany and the history of German dependency on Russian energy. It's a fascinating story. It's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast, Thomas. It's been an interesting week, I think, to say the least, in Germany. What's been happening since we last spoke to you?
I think there are two words one could use, gas and Gerhard Schröder. The first big news, so to speak, is that Gerhard Schröder returned to the public sphere. First of all, though, he gave an interview 1 week ago where he called the war in Ukraine a mistake on the side of the Russian government, but he also said that Russia would now want a negotiated solution if only the US would agree, and that Germany should activate Nord Stream 2. And yesterday, the SPD party court decided that Schröder could remain a member of the party despite his closeness to Vladimir Putin. And in a way, it's a very good segue to the other big topic that is at the moment dominating German news, and that's the supply of natural gas from Russia and the situation now and the expected situation in winter.
So how is Germany preparing for the winter to come? What are the expectations?
Well, the expectations are quite glum. So we had in the last couple of weeks already a lot of trouble with Nord Stream 1. Russia claiming they couldn't deliver gas due to a broken turbine. Then Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, also from the SPD, drove to Siemens in front of the turbine to prove that it was working indeed and that it was just an excuse on Russia's side. But of course, the big worry is that the gas supply will stop in winter, so that Putin will leverage the German energy dependence in order to gain concessions for his war in Ukraine. At the moment, the public mood, fortunately, is still in favor of supporting Ukraine, even if the energy prices would rise higher. So there was a poll a couple of weeks ago which said that 70% of all Germans were in favor of supporting Ukraine despite high energy prices, and only 22% of Germans said they wouldn't. It's quite interesting to see that there's quite a gap between the parties. So supporters of the Greens, but also of the Social Democrats, the Conservatives and the Liberals were in favor of supporting Ukraine, while only 14% of the AfD supporters were in favor of supporting Ukraine. And the AfD is, of course, a right-wing populist party in Germany. And also only 45% of the supporters of Die Linke, the post-communist party, said they would want support for Ukraine. However, I should also note, and that's another poll that maybe shows that the mood might swing slightly, only 35% of Germans said that Ukraine should receive further military support, and here the number is dropping by 9%. So it's difficult to say how it will turn out in autumn and winter. And of course, a huge challenge in the upcoming months is to keep the support for Ukraine high, despite the challenges in the area of energy supply.
We've spoken a lot on this podcast about the energy issues in relation to Germany. I think it's really helpful, just for the benefit of our listeners, given that we've got a little bit more time to talk about it today, to just contextualise this. I mean, how was it that Germany became so much more dependent on Russian gas than many other countries in Europe?
It's a long story, and in a way it's a story of the 20th century, and we can maybe briefly sum it up in three different periods. So one can say that it all starts with the Treaty of Rapallo we don't celebrate, but it's now the 100th anniversary. And that was after the First World War, when Germany and Russia agreed to waive any claims on reparations and so forth, and started to cooperate on energy. So that was particularly about oil. Soviet Russia promised to deliver oil from the fields in Baku to Germany, and Germany in turn promised to send industrial tools that would allow Russia to extract the oil without support from France or the UK. And in a way, this cooperation continued, always intermingled with periods of conflict, well until the Third Reich. And this is maybe the second example that one should keep in mind. August 39, when Stalin and Hitler agreed not only on carving up Eastern Europe, but also on allowing a lot of trade and energy export from Russia to Germany. And that only broke down, of course, on the 22nd of June 1941, when Nazi Germany attacked Russia. And then, so to speak, after the Second World War, we have the third period of German-Russian cooperation in the area of energy. And that starts basically almost in the late 1950s, when German businessmen said, well, wouldn't it be nice to get some gas and oil from the Soviet Union? At the time, that is being blocked by the US, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And another attempt is being made at the beginning of the 1970s. And here, for example, the work by the historian Frank Bösch is very interesting, and I'm drawing a lot on his articles here. Another date that we don't celebrate, but another anniversary, is almost exactly 50 years ago, on the 6th of July 1972, West Germany and the Soviet Union signed the first contract for natural gas. And basically, gas has never stopped flowing for, some brief periods, but it hasn't really stopped flowing ever since. And we can also see a continuous story that especially the Americans weren't happy, but in the wake of the oil crisis, 73, and also the Iranian Revolution in 79, became very clear that this was a beneficial step both for German industry, but also for Soviet Russia. After the end of the Cold War, sort of this cooperation continues, and the first plans for Nord Stream 1 are being made in 1995. And then 10 years later, Putin and Schröder sign the contract. It's very short before the general election in 2005. So it's September 2005 that Schröder signs the deal. finalizes this in October 2005 when he already had lost the election. And in December, he becomes the head of the shareholders committee of the Nord Stream AG. So this is his very swift change from chancellor to Russian gas lobbyist. And that's sort of the last period. And this is what we are still, the world that we live in today, or maybe a world that sort of ended on the 24th of February, but that still resonates today.
I'm really interested in this sort of second phase after during, should I say, the Cold War, when East Germany becomes particularly reliant on Russian gas for obvious reasons.
West Germany.
So, okay, sorry. West Germany became also equally reliant, even during the Cold War. Why would the Americans and the West Germans allow that?
Well, it's, first of all, an argument that we also heard in the last couple of years, but that was not entirely incorrect then, was that it was mainly about energy and not politics. Of course, one could always say that this is a bit naive, and that's certainly what the Americans thought. But during the Cold War, the Soviets never used gas supply as a weapon. And Frank Bösch, the historian, argues that this is because they didn't want to endanger one of the most important export markets. And what the Germans were saying is, I think one could use, for example, a quote from Helmut Schmidt, another social democratic chancellor, who said, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, well, the usual business with the Soviet Union needs to continue, but it should not be business as usual. So sort of trying to separate business from politics. And at the same time, he was telling Jimmy Carter, those engaging in trade with each other do not shoot at each other. And here we can see the belief in Germany and West Germany at the time, especially amongst the Social Democrats, that in a rapprochement with the East, peace politics go hand in hand with energy politics. So the success of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, the idea of accepting German borders, of trying to de-escalate, stepping back from nuclear war, and becoming more reliant on Russian energy sort of went hand in hand. And that was one of the main arguments. And of course, some plans didn't materialize. So there were a lot of grandiose plans of how cooperation could look like, and was always a back and forth. And the West Germans especially always needed to balance, the West and their commitment to NATO with the need of the industry for gas.
Fascinating. So it's not just a story, I think, as many listeners will have assumed, myself included, actually, of it really being about East Germany receiving lots of Russian gas and that connection continuing, because the West had never been as reliant. But actually, it was seen during the Cold War as something that was almost above politics, or as part of trying to ensure peace between the two sides, was to enable this energy policy. It's quite extraordinary, given everything that's happened since. We talked about the responsibility of Gerhard Schröder, and obviously Angela Merkel has also been critiqued, and a lot in relation to this. Who, in your view, is really responsible? Is it fair to critique those two specifically, or do you think actually this is a far, far broader trend?
I think this is a story that we really need to investigate and tell. Strikingly enough, I think there are too few books, too few investigations into these networks. What I would say is that we have to move from a very broad sense of Germany as only herself to blame, which of course to some degree is true, to a more specific question of who's actually to blame, who are the guilty men and women, so to speak, not of Whitehall but of the Reichstag. And here I think we can highlight the special role, especially of the Social Democrats. And maybe to illustrate this, we could turn to a very interesting book by a Danish journalist, Jens Hofsgaard, who published a book in Danish in 2017 and was translated into German in 2019 on gas, money and greed. And he starts with a dinner in 2010 between Matthias Warnig, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, Gerhard Schröder and Vladimir Putin in the Café d'Artiste. This restaurant doesn't exist anymore, but it was owned by Matthias Warnig's son Stefan. And Matthias Warnig is one of the key actors in the story, and he hasn't really received a lot of attention, unfortunately. And he used to be a former Stasi agent, so an agent of the East German secret police. He made contact with Vladimir Putin very early on, so some people say already during his time as an agent of the Stasi, when he met Putin in his capacity as KGB agent, but he definitely met him in St. Petersburg in the early 90s when he was representing the Dresdner Bank. And from then on, a friendship formed. He was taking care of Vladimir Putin's then wife when she had a terrible accident. And he was sort of trying to funnel Russian money into Germany. He tried to smooth the gears of business. And he was very successful. He became the CEO of the Nord Stream AG. He was continually hosting a lot of influential social democrats. And I think he's indicative in a way of a certain network in Germany, especially amongst the social democrats, but of course also including business members and important companies, but also politicians from the left and the AfD. And they were all trying to push for Nord Stream 1 and 2 to facilitate Germany's rising dependency on Russian energy and to combine it in a way with arguments about how sanctions should be lifted, how, for example, the realities of 2014 should be accepted. And maybe the last quote I could give here is by Matthias Platzek, another social democratic politician who in November 2014 said, well, now we have to legalize the annexation of Crimea, and it's impossible to imagine that Donetsk and Luhansk will ever return to Ukraine, or at least will return in the present circumstances. And I think this is very much a story that one should be telling and that one should be looking into more. The last person maybe one should mention is Manuela Schrazek, because she only stepped on the scene quite late, but she's currently the Minister President of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And she was in charge of founding a climate foundation, but it's not really a foundation about climate change. It's a foundation funded mostly by Gazprom and the Russian government to complete Nord Stream 2 when the Americans had already put the sanctions on Nord Stream. And this is a huge scandal that at the moment in Germany we start to investigate. There are some investigation committees, but Manuela Schrazek is still minister president. She lit up the Landtag in Schwerin in the colors of Ukraine, but the Ukrainian ambassador was quite enraged and called it hypocrisy, and probably in this case he had a point.
So, condensing what you've said, is it fair to say that it's a combination of ideology, political naivety, and greed that's essentially got Germany into this position?
I mean, of course, I wouldn't say necessarily greed, at least not in terms of Germany as a whole. I think here Hofsgaard found a very good title to his book, and that's the problem. So most of the people, myself included for a very long time, just weren't interested. And if we take another opinion poll from 2021, so after we've already seen a lot of war and terror and pressure, the vast majority of Germans were still in favor of completing Nord Stream 2 because it wasn't seen as a political project. The argument was always it's economic. It'll make sure that we can receive Russian gas at a cheaper rate because there's no meddling at the hands of the Ukrainians, etc. But it has no political component, really. And that's what we can see throughout history up until February of 2022, that most Germans, quite a few influential figures excluded, said that this is merely an economic question. So this is the first aspect. Then there is, of course, a problem for Germany to solve the energy dependency, because that's not a dependency that, I mean, that's a dependency that's just there. There are few natural gas resources in Germany, although there's now debate on whether we should restart fracking, whether we should continue using nuclear power. But up to then, it was mainly couched in economic terms.
So why is Russia not perceived as more of a threat?
So I would say there are three reasons, political, cultural, and economic. We've talked a lot about the economic side, so it was just very, very beneficial for Germany. And then there's the cultural component, that Russia is actually seen a bit as a canvas for various actors in Germany, especially on the left, but also on the right, as some sort of alternative to the West. So it goes back to the 19th century, to a certain infatuation with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and the deep Russian soul and so forth. And a lot of people thought that maybe Russia can provide, culture versus civilization, and Russia would be the way out of Western modernity. And then there's the political side, and here I would say that Russia was actually quite successful to infiltrate certain parts of the political elites. So we have the Social Democrats, who are always infatuated with the idea of Ostpolitik, and who are part of these networks that I try to illuminate a bit, where we have a lot of people who benefited personally from these links, but who were also in various committees, the the German-Russian Forum, etc. And then we have the business side, and that's also the appeal of dealing with Russia leniently for the conservatives. It says, well, there are economic benefits. And then we have the old left that sees Russia still as a big brother from the time of the GDR, and that's actually quite a significant factor. And then we have the AfD, who takes a completely different position, and that sees Putin as sort of the protector of traditional values against gay Europa, and that's the sort of the different appeal. And of course, it's impossible to bring them together. So the reason why the Social Democrats, for example, or at least a substantial part of them, they also include a lot of critical voices, but why a substantial part of the Social Democrats was looking to Russia has nothing to do with why, for example, the AfD is looking to Russia. But the fact that sort of a lot of major and minor players in Germany have very different reasons for arriving at the same conclusion is probably a big factor in why this was possible.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's fascinating hearing the sort of actual historical perspective of how we are than we are. That this is not just something that's a short-term issue, but actually something that's has a very long-term story, and no doubt will have a long one to go as well. My just final question would be a broader one, really, which is what's going to happen next, do you think? Where are the historical trends now steering us towards?
What I really hope is, and I see some evidence that this might is happening, and that's the most important thing, is that we finally take the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe seriously. And I've talked at the beginning a bit about the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, and that's, for example, one of the events that we really need to understand and put at the center of our collective memory, because this is a moment when Poland, the Baltic states are plunged into darkness for basically 50 years as Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia carve up their space. So what I would want to happen is to arrive at a truly post-colonial perspective that takes experience of Ukrainians, Poles, and the Balts seriously. And I think in Germany we might see a shift finally to a truly European way of looking at this. And that would, of course, include further support for Ukraine. It's very difficult to see what's going to happen in winter. It's probably a very tough winter, where Russia will try to solidify their gains, and we've heard this a lot on your podcast already. One of the weapons that they will definitely want to use is energy. I really hope that we sort of stand strong. And in the long term, I think actually this link between Germany and Russia when it comes to energy is probably severed, because as I mentioned, during the Cold War, there was always the understanding that the Russians would never use energy as a political weapon, at least not openly. And this idea is now completely dismissed. It's very clear that Russia is using energy as a weapon to foster the expansionist agenda, and this is why we can never go back to these probably quite naive economic arguments.
So you think there is the resolve amongst the political elite and the German people to see through winter and continue the support of the Ukrainian cause?
There needs to be, but of course, as I said, we also need to look into who's actually responsible for this. We need to get the files, and of course some files from the Nord Stream Climate Foundation couldn't be found. That's one of the major political scandals in Germany in this spring, and we really need to make sure that we can hold those accountable who are responsible for the predicament that we are in. And of course, we need to change our political culture so that we can start seeing the world through the eyes, not only of former Stasi cadres, but also through the eyes of, as I said, the Poles, the Balts, etc.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble.